Good morning, listeners. You're listening to the Lament of Hope blog and podcast. I'm here today with Isabel Vaughan-Spruce from the UK. Um, Many of you, especially who follow maybe ADF or freedom of speech kind of cases, will remember her. She was arrested twice in the UK, once in 2022, I think the second time in 2023, for praying silently outside of an abortion clinic. Um, and I'm just really fascinated by her story and would love to hear also just how she walked with the Lord through that, because that's a difficult time and that's persecution, which believers are promised to experience. Um, but it's hard to think of Christians, especially in Europe or in the United States, facing persecution because it's something you hear about in distant countries, more like um, India or Pakistan. So I wanted to ask Isabel, just to kind of get started, what gave you a heart for women in crisis, women who are experiencing a pregnancy they didn't expect? Because you're the director of UK March for Life, and it seems like you've been doing this for a really long time, so you have a heart for it. What cultivated that? Did you always have that, or what kind of sparked that?
Yeah, good question. I grew up in a Christian and a pro-life family, although I do say that I think being pro-life is like the default position of any child unless and until they're taught otherwise. I think to care about children is the most natural thing in the world, to care about babies is the most natural thing in the world. And thankfully I was never taught otherwise. In fact, I was really encouraged to recognize the value in each and every human being. Um, but I guess being pro-life didn't really become, my own belief rather than just my family's belief until I was in my teens. When I was in my teens, I used to enjoy reading a lot of war stories. You'd
Hmm.
really read about the kind of utmost worst, the real acts of depravity that people would cause, and the most terrible situations that people would be in. But you'd also see heroism at its finest. You'd see, the most incredible acts of bravery.
Yeah.
And as you do when you're reading a book, I would ask myself, what would I have done if I'd been back then? I'd put myself in those positions and say, would I have had the courage to say anything? Would I have had the conviction to do anything? And I gradually realized I was asking myself the wrong question, that it wasn't a case of
Hmm.
what would I have done then, but what am I doing now? There is a battle on. What am I doing about it? And that's the only way to find out what I would have done back then is to look at my life now.
Hmm.
And I particularly recognised that the battle was going on in the pro-life sphere, as in there really was still one section of the population who was being regarded as subhuman or non-human, and that's those in the womb. Um, and I happened to just read a letter one day in a magazine about somebody who was praying outside an abortion centre.
Hmm.
And thankfully, she'd left contact details. So I got in touch and she told me about the nearest place to me where other people were just praying for an hour on a Saturday. And so I went along with my sister and one of my brothers just to see what went on there. I have to be honest, to start with, what really motivated me to go was the injustice against the unborn. I recognized the humanity of the preborn child, and to think that they had less rights or even no rights really, really concerned me. But it was after going outside the abortion center a few times that my heart really began to turn towards women in crisis pregnancy
Hmm.
situations. You'd see them coming out of the abortion center with just a real lost look in their eyes. You'd see them being sick into the gutter and crying into their phones. And you realize that their problems hadn't been solved by going into that abortion center. They just created new and far bigger problems. So I
Hmm.
guess that's what really turned my heart towards the women. It wasn't initially why I went, but the more and more that I have got involved in pro-life work, the more I've realized that the injustice abortion causes women alone, that makes me pro-life.
Hmm. What um that's interesting because the pro-life movement, I think specifically here in the United States, there is a huge emphasis on the baby, which of course is important. Um, but a lot of times the women are viewed as like terrible people, right? Murderers, or how could you possibly do something like that? I even kind of thought of that honestly growing up in the Christian community for a while. And then I had an opportunity to talk to some of these ladies for an article I was writing, And I just realized that a lot of them just, were 15. I had one lady tell me her boyfriend drove her to the clinic. Um, and she was young, she didn't want to, but he wanted her to. So there's all this pressure, which doesn't negate the decision. But at the same time, it was like really realizing, would I do that too? If I was in that situation. Um, what in the women you've interacted with, how has your perspective kind of shifted from, okay, these people are, murdering, killing their kids, to, okay, these people really need ministering to, they need love, they need to know there's other options?
Yeah, I think if we really want to end abortion, then it is our duty to understand what's going on here,
Hmm.
understand these women and understand the men as well who are involved, because it is important that we recognise that men are also involved in abortions, very much so. And I think something that's really helped me to understand the situation more is I've connected with we've got an organisation here called Rachel's Vineyard, and I know it operates in certainly
Yeah.
some parts of America.
Hmm.
And I work very closely with the Rachel's Vineyard in our area. And I'm often talking to women and men who've been through that program of healing. And it's for anyone who's been hurt by abortion in any way, whether that's directly or indirectly. And some of these women that I've been talking to, that they've had multiple abortions, sometimes in double figures. And like you, there would have been a time in my life where I'd have thought, how could a woman have that many? You make a mistake once, but to keep on making it,
Hmm.
and to keep on making the same mistake. But you do realize that if they don't get healing, then this is what happens. You just reenact that trauma. And there's that bit in the Bible that talks about um, loving our neighbor as ourselves. And I
Yeah.
think this is a really important quote, because so often the problem that a lot of women have, from the ones that I've spoken to, is that they don't love themselves.
Hmm.
And if they love their neighbor as themselves, it's with this same very weak, very conditional love that they have for themselves. And that's often because they haven't had real love shown to them. Maybe not by a father, maybe not by, particularly by a male figure in their life. A real love that's not just, wanting something back,
Yeah.
not just loving to get something, but really loving because it sees that value in the other. And a lot of those women haven't experienced that, and in fact, have experienced quite the opposite of being used. And because of that, I think they don't really value themselves. They don't really love themselves. And so if they have to choose between, for instance, their boyfriend and their baby, if their boyfriend is saying, I'll leave you if you continue this pregnancy, if you have that baby,
Right.
um, for them, even though they're getting a very weak conditional love from their boyfriend, they would rather have that than nothing at all. Or if
Right.
it's a choice between their career and their baby, their career is what makes them feel valued, what makes them feel worth something. And
Hmm.
so they will choose that because that's the only kind of value that they have. So it's so important to help women and girls sometimes to recognize their own value, because if they don't recognize their value and how loved they are just because of who they are, not because of anything they do, um, then it's really hard to love somebody else, to love your neighbor, your unborn, your preborn neighbor as yourself, if you don't love yourself. So I've realized for me that my mission is,
Hmm.
at least part of that is when I'm talking to women or couples who are in these challenging pregnancy situations, is to help them realize their own worth, but ideally long time before that, before they even get into that situation. The women that need to hear that message won't have it written on their forehead. And so I think it is important just to be freer with how we complement each other in a genuine way, and I'm talking about sort of affirming each other,
Hmm.
particularly for women, particularly for girls, for teens, to really affirm women, so that they realize how precious they are, how valuable they are, when
Hmm.
they are comfortable in that love. They know how loved they are. Then it's much easier to love that child inside them. So I think that is a key part of this situation.
Is there a story or a woman in particular in your experience that you worked with, um, that you saw that come to fruition through her being able to experience healthy love, love that is actually true and scriptural, biblical?
I've been blessed to work with people at kind of all stages of this journey. You know, people who are, you know, just finding out they're pregnant, people who are at the doors of the abortion centre, you know, people who have gone through an abortion, people who've changed their mind, people who've had multiple abortions. One that particularly sticks out with me is a friend of mine, Rachel, and I'm allowed to say her name because she's very public herself about her story. And Rachel actually runs a branch of Rachel's Vineyard over here in England. And one of the things that Rachel said to me, which has always really stuck with me, is that she needed to know she was loved before she ever recognized that there was anything wrong with abortion. She needed to know she was loved before she said sorry, before she repented. So
Mm.
not being loved because you've realized you've done something wrong. It's not that we love you because you've said sorry, now we love you. She needed to experience that unconditional love to help her get to that place. And she
Mm.
needed to know she was loved, even if she never said sorry. You know, she needed to know she was loved. And
Mm.
she said it was meeting pro-life people who really had that heart of flesh, not a heart of stone, that really loved her, that helped her to transform her own life and to be able to
Mm.
recognize the value of her two children that she aborted. And now she is able to help so many other people through the ministry that she's involved with. But that's
Mm.
because of the fact that she was loved and had that love shown to her by others. And now she's an instrument of love herself with so many women and men that she works with who are often in very broken situations.
Yeah.
She very much knows what that's like, you know. And a lot of women and men as well, their story starts in childhood. It's not their abortion story doesn't start the day they get pregnant. Their abortion story will often start way back. You know,
Yeah.
maybe when they were experiencing neglect or abuse. That's when the kind of the seed was planted that ended up coming, um, you know, to its own in the abortion. And
Mm.
it's really helping women or men to understand that, to understand themselves, so that they can, you know, turn their trajectory from one that is repeating this abortion or repeating acts that are not loving, and become you know, much more loving, much more merciful, much more forgiving of themselves and of others. Um, but that they have to understand themselves and what's gone on first. And programs like Rachel's Vineyard really help with that.
Have you ever found it difficult to love these ladies?
I have to say that's something that I can say I've honestly been really blessed with,
Mm.
is really having a heart for people who've been through abortion, who are considering abortion. And I don't say that as to put myself on a pedestal or to sound self-righteous or pious. It's a
Yeah.
grace from God, and maybe because God wanted me to be involved in this ministry, that I can truly say I've recognised when interacting with these people that, you know, there but for the grace of God go I. You know,
Mm.
their weakness might be different from my own, their sins might be different from my own, but I know what it's like to feel fear and to act on fear. You know, I know what it's like to make bad decisions, that I know are bad decisions and still make them anyway. You know,
Yeah.
so I really do feel that I can connect with these women, as in from a spiritual perspective. You know, I do understand these difficulties,
Yeah.
and rather than sort of, like I say, any kind of judgment. I can truly say that I've been blessed with a real heart for people who are in such difficult situations, and not necessarily sort of from a practical perspective. Because in a way, when I meet a woman who's in a crisis pregnancy situation and the problem is purely practical, as in, you know, they're struggling for somewhere to live or they're struggling financially, in a way that's relatively easy to sort out. We can
Yeah.
find people who will help with finances or accommodation, and these are challenges, don't get me wrong, but it's more when someone has a real, like I say, a real problem spiritually. Maybe they really don't love themselves, or they can't forgive themselves for a previous abortion.
Mm.
Again, I know somebody who said to me that she had two abortions, and she said that when she was pregnant the second time, she said she'd already felt that even though she didn't, at that time in her life, she didn't believe in God, she felt she was going to hell for what she'd done for the first abortion.
Mm.
And she reasoned with herself, well, I can't go to hell twice, so what does it matter if I have another abortion? And it
Right.
made me realize how important it was for women and men to find that healing, because if they don't, if they feel so worthless about themselves, well, what does it matter what I do with my life now? You know, I'm lost, I'm damned.
Yeah.
That's so often what people can be feeling after an abortion. So it is so important to help build people back up. Like we say, not justifying anything anyone's done. In fact, that is a key part of it, to help women realize the truth of what they've done,
Yeah.
but with love, with love.
And this is, I was gonna ask you, how many times would you go? I mean, I'm sure you probably still do, but how many times have you would go to the pregnancy center and be praying for these ladies? Have you done this for years or?
So it's an abortion centre that I pray outside, and I've been
Right.
going there probably for about 20 years. I
Wow.
would generally go once a week, maybe for a couple of hours or so. I run a 40 Days for Life campaign here in Birmingham, where we have 40 days of continuous prayer. And when that campaign is running, I'll often go more frequently than that. But outside campaigns, I would be going once a week to pray and to offer help. Obviously, at the moment, we've got PSPOs, which are public protection orders, which are a type of buffer zone, which makes it much more difficult to offer help. But I can at least pray outside the abortion centre, and offer help from outside the buffer zone. Um, but I know many, many women who have accepted help outside the very gates of the abortion centre. Sometimes, they've actually been literally about to have the abortion. They've been gowned up with their
Mm.
gown and their wrist tag on, literally about to have the abortion, and at the last second have come out. And many of them have actually said it's because of the prayers. They said, I could feel your prayers even
Oh,
inside
wow.
that abortion centre.
So how long have these buffer zones been around? Because I know there was one in place the first time you were arrested in 2022, but before that, were there buffer zones or?
So these particular zones, as I say, they're called PSPOs, public space protection orders, and they were originally for things like to deal with things like dog fouling and drunken disorderly behaviour. So they were local laws brought in by local councils and local police forces working together to just deal with a particular problem in a localised area. But sadly, they've been abused, in my opinion, to create these buffer zones in certain areas. So the first one happened in a place called Ealing in London, and we now have 5 different zones around the country, one of them being in Birmingham. The
Mm.
one in Birmingham came into place, like you say, in 2022. It was in September 22. That one came into place. The one in Ealing was there a bit before that, a year or two before that. The one in Ealing happened. Um,
Were you aware of that buffer zone before you went and prayed that day in November?
Yes. So my volunteers, as I say, my volunteers, it's the 40 Days for Life campaign I run. We used to pray outside a very big abortion centre in Birmingham. It was actually the first one that ever opened in the country. And they did about 10,000 abortions a year at their peak. So a very, very busy abortion centre. And they closed at the end of 2019, quite miraculously, in my opinion. Even the
Mm.
manageress didn't seem to be able to give a reason when we asked her why it had closed. She just said, oh, things change. But obviously we knew the answer. The reason was because of prayer.
Yeah.
So in 2020, we moved to a new abortion centre, slightly less busy, but still doing a few thousand a year. And when we first started praying there was some locals who really opposed our presence. They obviously had a very different ideology to ours, and they would be very aggressive towards us. And just to say, we would be praying like 2 or 3 people at a time outside the abortion centre, not a big crowd, nothing noisy. We didn't actually have any posters at all. It would just be a couple of people with some leaflets of help outside the abortion centre. But as I say, some of the locals really opposed this, and they would be very aggressive. So we were sworn at and spat at. We had our property stolen. We'd have cars driving high speed down the street towards us and then veering away at the last second. We were physically assaulted. It was a really, really difficult situation. And, even when we caught these assaults on camera, if we shared them with the police, I remember the police saying to me, well, if you don't want to be assaulted, you don't have to come out of your house, do you? That was the response we were getting from the police.
Hmm.
So we had this very difficult situation, and that was the start of the buffer zones being voted in. The police really didn't appear to be neutral from our perspective. They seemed to be taking sides, as in, they didn't seem to want to deal with any of the situations that came up when we were being assaulted by locals. And just to stress, it wasn't anyone using the abortion centre that was being aggressive towards us. It was just some of the people who lived in the locality.
Hmm.
So the police worked together with the local council, obviously with the staff of the abortion centre, to bring in this zone, which meant that it was about a 120 meters one way and about a bit more than that the other way. So a zone around this abortion centre where protesting was banned. So with
Hmm.
my 40 Days for Life volunteers, I got them to pray outside the zone. It was actually outside a church right down the end of the road, barely even in sight of the abortion centre. And just to say, they were still assaulted, they were still spat at and sworn at, they still had their property stolen, which
Hmm.
I think just helps illustrate that those people bringing in this buffer zone weren't really doing it because they were concerned about women being harassed or intimidated, because clearly my volunteers were barely even in sight of the abortion centre anymore. It was because of an intolerance of any ideology different to their own.
Hmm.
So it was in that atmosphere that I thought, well, okay, protesting has been banned. I don't protest outside abortion centres. I pray there and I offer help. That's not protest.
Hmm.
So I thought at the very least I will be able to go in and just silently say my prayers. Um, so when I went into the abortion zone, the abortion centre was actually closed, and I just went and stood a distance away from it, just silently saying my prayers. So I wasn't manifesting it in any way. I wasn't holding any posters or leaflets or a Bible or rosary beads or anything like that. I was just simply praying in my head.
And it was just
And that's
you, right?
absolutely. So it was just
Hmm.
me by myself. So from anyone walking past, I might have been waiting for a taxi. I might, I could have just been standing on a street corner waiting for a friend to join me. There wasn't anything to kind of show that I was thinking thoughts towards God. Not that it should matter if I was. But that was all it took for the police to come out, and they asked me if I was protesting, and I said no, I'm not protesting. They said, are you praying? And I said, well, I might be in my head, but nothing out loud. And that was enough for them to arrest me.
How did you feel like at that moment when they arrested you? What was your gut response?
Um, Interesting, really, because actually it felt very similar to the very first time I went outside an abortion centre, and there was um, two sort of feelings that I had that very first time that I went outside. One was I felt it felt very surreal. I remember the first time I was outside an abortion centre to think, this beautiful building that I was looking at, because physically it was a very attractive building in a very leafy street, a very expensive part of Birmingham in England. And to think, gosh, behind those doors, 10,000 children each year lose their lives intentionally, legalised, sanctioned by our government. It seemed very surreal. It was hard to really take that in. But I also felt very much at peace. Now, not at peace with what was going on, but peace that I was where I was meant to be.
Hmm.
And when I was being arrested, I would say both of those two things were how I felt. It felt very surreal, in as much as it didn't even really sink in until I myself looked back at the videos, that I was being arrested for simply just silently saying some prayers in my head on a street corner. But at the same time, I did feel really at peace. I felt I was where I
Hmm.
was meant to be. Whatever else goes on, that's not my affair. I'm where God wants me to be, and I felt very at peace with that.
Did feeling at peace, did that surprise you? Because I know even for me as a believer and something the Lord's still working on with me, when something hard happens, that's usually not my response. Sometimes the Lord blesses me with a feeling of, okay, the Lord's going to take care of this. I can rest in Him. But a lot of times there's this panic. I think for a lot of believers too, there's, we hear stories like this and we freak out. It's like, oh my gosh, I could never go through that. Um, and in some ways, sometimes there's even just a frantic approach of, okay, how am I going to protect myself? How am I going to protect the people around me so that this never happens? And interestingly, in scripture, it's clear that you can't really stop something like this from happening. Like, obviously, we want to fight for what is true and just, but at the same time, we can't expect there to never be persecution or something that intrudes on our lives and causes pain. And so I wondered for you, like, were you even surprised by the reaction you had that you felt peaceful about it?
I guess not at the time. And I do know what you mean in a way, as much as sometimes I'm surprised at how God answers how God answers prayers, and I'm surprised by that.
Yeah.
I know afterwards, so many people told me they've been praying about my situation, and I've been blessed to have messages literally from all over the world for people to say they've been praying about this situation. God
Mm.
doesn't act in time, so I know that those prayers, probably were the prayers that sustained me when I was being arrested and helped me to feel so at peace.
Well,
And uh, I shouldn't feel surprised at that because I know prayers are answered. But yes, I do sometimes, like you, sort of almost think, I expected to maybe be more shocked or upset or bothered by it because it was a very unpleasant thing to happen.
sure.
Um, but in a way, I guess I personally find more challenging are the situations like, obviously for like a shared for years and years, I've been praying outside abortion centres. And some of those times will be times when I was there and maybe people were going in and out of an abortion centre, and maybe I had no response at all, whether it was passers-by not responding at all, maybe people going in and out of an abortion centre who just didn't interact with me. Sometimes that's actually harder to deal with.
Mm.
um, to feel that you might be there for 2 or 3 hours and just it almost seems like from a human perspective, what was the point of that? Nobody even noticed.
Mm.
Obviously, our faith tells us that there was a point in it, but that can be much harder just to keep on going week in, week out, whether we're having a response or not, whether that's a good response or not. Obviously, sometimes we'll get people going past, and like I've said, they'll be shouting, they'll be being abusive, they'll be mocking, all those kinds of things. Um, to carry on going in those situations, but particularly in the situations when you're not getting any response at all, sometimes that
Mm.
can be just as if not more challenging.
Yeah.
In a way, it doesn't surprise me that there is such a kickback because I know how powerful that prayer in that particular place is.
Mm.
I think if thousands of children are being aborted at an abortion centre each year, that's a huge amount of evil that's happening there. And that's not necessarily to accuse any particular person, but just to say we know that is evil that's happening. So from a spiritual perspective, it's like you've got two opposing armies meeting. We've got
Mm.
Christians coming along and praying. You've got all these children that are being aborted, and it almost reminds me of the old sort of Western cowboy films when you'd have like the empty streets with a bit of tumbleweed, and you'd have two people coming towards each other, with their hands on their holsters, and it's like there's a line drawn. And it's almost a bit like that, these two armies coming towards each other, and of course there's going to be an explosive reaction in some way by such evil being confronted by intense prayer.
Mm.
So it shouldn't really surprise us, even though sometimes it does.
What, how long were you in jail the first time?
So I was arrested and I was put in a prison cell.
Okay.
Sorry, in a police cell, a police cell. Um, and I was in a police cell for a few hours,
Okay.
in the police cell, until I was taken out to be questioned. Well, I had to wait for my for a solicitor to come. I requested a solicitor, and then I was questioned under caution. The police wanting to know, what I'd been praying about, what had been going on in my head, which again
Mm.
seems slightly surreal that anyone should even think they had a right to know what my prayers were about.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, that I was then or I was then put back in the police cell for a while before eventually being released on bail, um, and eventually being given a charge.
So, and this happened again because you went back um, in 2023 and the same thing, similar happened. Did you, after getting out the first time and experiencing this, getting the charge, um, were you afraid to go back and do it again?
Well, on the contrary, because I was charged and I went to court after the first arrest, I was completely acquitted in court of any wrongdoing. So my reasoning after that is, okay, if anyone was in any doubt, now it should be crystal clear in everyone's mind. I've been to court, I've been acquitted.
Mm,
Clearly, we all recognize now that I'm allowed to silently pray on a street corner if I so wish, you know?
yeah,
So I had even greater confidence that what I was doing was a perfectly acceptable thing, not only from a moral perspective, but in the eyes of the law. So I was even more surprised the second time to have actually this time 6 police officers came with a police van to arrest me. And they actually said to me, your prayers are an offence. And when I said I didn't think prayer was offensive, they just became even more emphatic and said they are an offence. And that's when they arrested me for a second time.
how did that feel? Were you angry?
Um, Not actually at that exact time. Yes, afterwards there would have been some feelings of anger. Again, at the time, maybe again a similar feeling. I felt that this is where I'm meant to be. What they do in a way is their affair. Um, I'm meant to be here, and I'm meant to be praying. And I know that's what God wants from me. Um, but yes, afterwards, that I did feel angry at the injustice of it,
Yeah,
um, and in a way that what was happening to me was what I was being accused of, you know, whether it's intimidating women or harassing women, and yet I was the one being intimidated and harassed.
yeah.
Um, you know, being arrested by 6 police officers, and taken away in a police van simply for silently saying my prayers. That's intimidation. And yet, for me
Yeah.
to be silently praying near an abortion centre, like I say, people going in that wouldn't have even been aware of what I was doing or what I was doing it for.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, the irony was really there.
And there was it late 2023 you actually received a letter of apology after the second arrest?
Just to say, when I had this email, which was the letter, it was actually in an email form. I think it was probably September or October last year. And although there was an apology of kind in there, it wasn't really a letter of apology. It said something like
Okay.
that the charges were being dropped and sorry it had taken so long. So they weren't really saying that they were sorry that it had happened, but merely just sorry for the length of time because it had been 6 months, as in 3 months of bail and another 3 months of so-called investigation before they came back saying that nothing was happening and charges were being dropped. So
And this
that
was
was
on
the
top
only
of,
apology.
I was going to say, this was on top of the first arrest. So this was a, what, 2 year process almost?
No, so the first arrest would have happened in December 2022.
Okay.
And I was then rearrested in the March of 2023, so sort of 3+ months later, um, 3 to 4 months later. And then I received that letter in the September of that year.
Okay.
So that would have been 6 months after that I
So
received
almost a
the,
year. Okay.
yeah, sort of 9 months after 9 to 10 months after my initial arrest.
And when you received that email, because like you said, it's not really an apology. Um, how have you um been able to forgive this offense? Because you're not going to be able, most likely, it would be wonderful if you do, but being able to receive an official apology or a recognition of wrongdoing, that this is wrong, we don't want to do this to someone else. Um, what has kind of helped you in the process of being able to forgive and being like, okay, I can't hold bitterness against the police or the system for the fact that this has happened to me.
I think, like, I suppose for a lot of us, particularly who are Christians, but even more than that, I think recognizing that the bitterness will just be something that hurts me, that will be a burden for me. Um, but I do still believe that justice should be sought, and so
Yeah.
whilst I do forgive, individual officers for how they've behaved, I still want that corrected. It does make you feel quite vulnerable when you realize that the authorities who are there to protect you, to protect your rights, actually have quite the opposite agenda, and they're actually the ones who are the ones who seem to be taking away your rights, and your most basic rights, even your rights to be able to think what you want. it,
Hmm.
it, it is really concerning, and like I say, you do feel quite vulnerable thinking, gosh, who do I call on now if even the police are the ones who are
Yeah.
like I say, coming out to arrest me because they don't like what I'm thinking. um, that's that needs to be corrected. And so I think it is important to recognise the difference between seeking justice, and unforgiving. Whilst I
Hmm.
do forgive, I do still believe justice needs to be sought, and that's something that I am still looking into. To try and, for the very least, of other people and for this cause, to make sure that the police don't continue in that way.
And then just one last question for you. What, Isabel, how would you encourage believers who, um, are just afraid of facing persecution of any kind, afraid of doing something that may be offensive to someone else? Um, a lot of times in scripture, it talks so much about love and charity and kindness. I think it can be easy for believers to think, oh, okay, if I'm going to be loving and kind, then I need to not do anything that can be offensive or can be seen as unloving. So best not to do anything that can, even toe that line. And sometimes that means just inaction, doing nothing, um, kind of keeping a very neutral line. Um, how would you encourage, people who are afraid? It's interesting because we're talking about ladies who are afraid, making wrong choices, right? And then you even have on the other end of it, you have even people who believe in wanting to help these ladies and wanting to provide options for them who are afraid to do that because they don't want to be persecuted. They don't want people to think that they hate them. Um, how would you encourage them based on your own experience?
You brought up something that I myself often bring up, and it's such an important point, that if we want to be people of integrity, we can't be telling other people not to be ruled by their fears if we are ourselves ruled by our fears.
Hmm.
And that is so often a message that in one way or another I'm giving out to women if I'm talking to them, because inevitably that's what drives pretty much every woman to the abortion centre, is
Yeah.
that fear, fear of losing her boyfriend, fear of struggling with money, fear of telling her parents, fear of having a child who isn't deemed perfect, whatever. It's fear, it's fear. So if it's fear driving her there, and we are telling her not to make decisions based on fear, but to make decisions based on love, we've got to first and foremost do that ourselves. And in a
Hmm.
way, the only way we really get to that place where we're at peace with making decisions based on love and not on fear, is through our personal relationship with God, and having a really deep and true personal relationship. um, which is why when I'm, obviously getting people contacting me to maybe join our 40 days campaign or helping with March for Life, one of the things I always try and encourage is that person's own prayer life. If we're not people of prayer, if we're not rooted in prayer ourselves, then we will go one of two different ways. We'll either become inactive and just, you know like you say, almost feel overwhelmed by this battle or fearful of this battle, or we get really involved, but we become people who are quite harsh. And you do meet
Hmm.
some people like this,
Yeah.
who can be very critical of others, who are like we've sort of touched on a little bit, maybe, like, claiming that people are murderers and things that really aren't helpful. So to find that middle ground, that true ground, where we're recognizing that the wrong of abortion, but we're also speaking in love, requires us to have a really deep and true relationship with God.
Mm.
And one of the people I look up to, a saint from quite a while ago, Saint Edith Stein, who was herself killed in a concentration camp in World War II. She talked about that combination of love and truth, and she used to say that, love without truth is a counterfeit love, and truth without love is a counterfeit truth. And that
Mm.
really resonates with me, particularly in this issue of abortion, that we have to have those really knitted together perfectly, so that we don't become sort of artificially compassionate, so that we're sort of saying, oh, don't worry, you did what you thought was best, to people who've had an abortion. We have to be honest about it. Abortion takes a human life. Of course, that was the wrong thing to do. But we also need to be people of love, so that we're not just standing there finger wagging in judgment, um,
Mm.
because that judgment will come back to hit us one day.
Well, Isabel, I want to thank you so much. And again, for listeners, there are several articles about Isabel's case and the experience that she had. I know ADF International has a really good article on it with pretty lengthy details about the arrests as well as what Isabel does now. And then, Isabel, if people are interested in your organization, the website domain is like March for Life UK. How can they find you if
But
they want to learn more?
yeah, marchforlife.co.uk is the
Okay.
website, but we're also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, definitely to look on that, and to connect if you want. Our contact details are there if people want to find out any more about the work that we do or want to get involved in the UK. We'd love to hear from them.
Well, Isabel, again, thank you so much. It's been encouraging to me, and I really hope that this is encouraging and, in some ways, hopefully convicting for listeners as well.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome.